All right, car photography. Everybody loves shooting it. Today I'm gonna show you how to edit it. This is just how I edit stuff. You do with this information what you will. I just wanna take y'all along. But okay, starting off, let's jump into Lightroom and I will show y'all how I edit some of these photos. So let's start off with this photo I made of this red Toyota 86 that I shot just the other day actually. This picture was like, it couldn't have been better, dude. I was so happy with this picture. I knew as soon as I saw it in my brain, it was gonna be a great photo. So let's start editing it. I usually go along with the same process for just about every photo. I start up here, adjusting light and such. And I usually, most of the time, do the exact same thing. A lot of times I like to bring the highlights up because I like some contrast, but I didn't really want to do that this time. We'll probably start off with highlights, probably somewhere around -35, and bring the shadows up a good bit, because as you can see, it's pretty dark over here in these trees and in the front of this car and that kind of thing. So let's bring the shadows up probably somewhere like +90, and we can add some contrast later to this. Right now it looks pretty flat, looks pretty raw, but we'll add some contrast and some real good light and dark areas in this in just a bit. I always do this. I bring the whites up to 10 and the blacks down to -10. This just gives you a little base contrast that is a good starting place. It takes it from being like a super raw image to not quite as raw. So point curve next. I usually just, like I say, go down from top to bottom when it comes to my edits. I don't really have a particular order that I do stuff in. So let's bring this bottom node up a little bit, and what that does is that brings the blacks up so they're not quite true dark black. It adds a little bit of fade in there, and I just have been liking that in my images lately. So add a little bit of fade in here, then we will take the blacks down, add that node right there, and that helps us adjust the blacks. Then I'll add another node up here, and I, for whatever reason, like to click and drag it from the middle. That doesn't do anything at all, but that's just how I do it. Bring the highlights up just a little bit, give that a real nice contrast. And then I take this top node up here and bring it over just a little bit. And so that makes the highlights just a little bit softer. It's like adding a little bit of fade in the highlights, if that makes any sense. Just like we did with the blacks, adding a little bit of fade. In the blacks, we'll add a little bit of fade in the highlights, and that just helps everything be very soft overall. Not too bright, the highlights aren't gonna be too harsh. I think that looks good right there. Not that. That looks good right about there, probably. Blacks could come down just a little bit more. I think that looks good. Okay, the way I usually start my edits is by cropping if I need to, and I definitely forgot to do that at the beginning of this, because this building over here and this little back tire of this car is not really something I want in this image. So I'll bring that over there, crop the building out all the way, bring this right side in to help center up that car right in the middle of the frame, and bring it down just a little bit. I think I like that right there. Let's look at it. Yep, I think that looks good. It could probably do with just a slight straighten, just a little bit. Yeah, that looks good right there. So this is a good starting point right here for us to jump into the more color focused side of things. When it comes to vibrance and saturation, I usually sort of do the same thing most every time. I'll do +15, -10. And so what that does is vibrance increases the the brightness of the colors. It's sort of like luminance. It's like the intensity of the colors. And the contrast of the colors, that kind of thing. And saturation just brings the overall the saturation, it brings the overall intensity of the color back down just a little bit. I like how these two play off each other a little bit. It's really subtle, but it just adds a little bit of pop without it being too overpowering in terms of the saturation. All right, so let's jump into our color mixer here. This is usually where I go to get all the colors in the image exactly how I want them before I come down to color grading and such. So this is a bright red car. I don't know if it translates super well. This picture's a little dark, but this car is bright red. And I want to make sure that's highlighted. That's, obviously it's the center point of the photo, and I want to make sure that it's highlighted as best as it can be. So let's bring the reds over just a little bit towards this more purple, because if you bring them over here, that front bumper turns gross and we don't want that. So let's do like -25 on the hue for the reds, something like +10 for saturation, and then plus maybe 12 or 15 luminance. And that just helps sort of even out the lighting on the car a little bit. I forgot my polarizer for this shoot, like an idiot. It's like I've never shot a car before in my life, but I forgot my polarizer for this shoot, and so we sort of just have to work around that as best I can and sort of deal with it. Hydration, back into it. Okay, let's jump over into the oranges now. The oranges, I don't like them always to be exactly orange, dragging them, especially for this one as well, like dragging them over a little bit towards the purples. As you can see, it's messing with these road lines mostly, and I'm not a big fan of yellow in my pictures, hardly ever. So dragging this over just a little bit, maybe like -20 is about where I want to be, and then bringing the saturation down about -15, and mess with the luminance just a little bit so the road lines don't, they're there, but they don't quite pop like they, were otherwise. So bring the luminance down. As you can see, that's too much. That's way too much. So let's bring the luminance down like -10. All right, going into the yellows, like I just said, I don't really care for yellow in my pictures. It's rare that I want yellow, very rare. So let's drag the yellows over, not quite all the way to orange because that's a little much, but about halfway there. And then, okay, now that we've messed with the hue of the oranges, let's bring the saturation up just a little bit. And the luminance, I think. Yeah, that's good. So these trees in the background are really benefiting from that adjustment because they've got a lot of yellow in them. So sort of just messing with those trees in the background. Now when it comes to greens, everybody's kind of got their own philosophy when it comes to greens. A lot of people like their greens to be like photorealistic, perfectly realistic. They want them exactly as they looked in real life. I don't really subscribe to that. I think most greens are way too much in pictures. So I do sort of the same thing every time when it comes to greens. I like my greens to be fairly consistent. So I will drag them over towards the yellows, and that gives it a little bit, that yellow tinge in there, and helps it it sort of mutes them. Because if you drag it over here, that is atrocious in my opinion. I don't like that at all. I think that's way too much, way too green. It's not for me. So I drag it over to the yellows a little bit, and I will bring the saturation down by a good amount. So that gives you these way more muted greens in terms of like the intensity of the color. They're much more muted, and I will bring down the luminance as well to maybe like 25, so that these greens are really understated. I want them to be there obviously, but I don't want them to be that super bright blue, tealy green. That's just too much. All right, moving into cyan, let's bring it towards the blues a little bit. And this, as you can see, is affecting that windshield, and I don't quite want the windshield to be that green color, so let's bring it over towards the blues and bring the saturation down a good bit, because I don't really want all that blue in the windshield as it stands. All right, now let's mess with the blues. As you can see, we've got a little bit of blue in the frame, not too much, but enough. I usually tend to have my blues on the side of teal rather than purple, like that royal blue. I don't really care for that. I don't necessarily do the teal and orange thing super heavy, but I also prefer my blues to be a little bit brighter and more lively, a little bit greener overall than that purple. And let's bring, like I said, I don't want too much in it just yet. I'll reintroduce some when we get to color grading, but I don't want too much of the blue in the image just before we get to color grading. And let's bring down the luminance a little bit, so it is a little bit darker, as you can see in that sign back there, but that sign's not staying. Mostly we're focusing on the windshield. I want to make it look like as black or as gray as it can, because that's what it looks like in real life. I mean, it's not blue, as you can see right here. That's just kind of how it picks up, but it's not blue. All right, and then, so something weird about this location is that a lot of the road registers purple in the camera. So I sort of had to do a good bit of like tweaking to get the purples where I wanted them. And a lot of this car, because I didn't bring my polarizer, it changes, it gets purpley up in here. And so you want to get the purples sort of as even as you can so that this red stays consistent across the car. So I dragged the hue of the purples all the way over. And as you can see on the hood and such, that really helps even out the color of the car, of that red paint. So after we drag the hues over there, I want to bring the saturation down a little bit, maybe like -25. And that just, you know, mutes it a little bit because that can get really strong. So let's bring down the saturation to about -25. I think that looks good. And then let's go to magenta, and this is the same thing. It shows up a lot up here in these reflections. So I dragged the magenta hue all the way over. As you can see, that front bumper right there. Without that, it gets a little bit of purpley pink in there. If you drag it over, that's red. That's exactly where we want it. Bring that saturation up so that it sort of falls in line with the other red bits of the car, and bring the luminance up just a little bit. And that just really helps even out the paint color of the car, and that's what I'm trying to do. All right, now let's go into our color grading. Actually, before we go into color grading, this is something I like to do on most of my photos. I bring the clarity, the universal clarity down, and I'll reintroduce that later using masks, because I think that just tends to work better. It allows you to really focus in what you want people to look at. So I tend to bring down the clarity. Most of my presets have -12, 13 clarity, and I'll reintroduce that with masks for specific images. All right, now the color grading. Let's start off with the shadows, because as you can see, there's gonna be a lot of those here, and that's something we have to really figure out. That's gonna dominate the image. So teal, a little bit of teal, light blue in the shadows, I think works really well. It sort of makes those greens in the trees pop, but not too much. It brings that out a little bit, and it gives a real nice cool air to the shadows in the car as well as the road. And the mid-tones, let's do a little bit of orange, almost a yellowy orange, yellowy orange, I'm 4. Because that's gonna affect this sky up here a good bit. So let's bring that mid-tones to the oranges a little bit like that, and let's do the same thing for the highlights. Sort of match the highlights and the mid-tones so that up here gets that nice sort of pale orange, and headlights and, you know, just anything bright is getting that little bit of orange. I am starting to really like this. I think this looks really good. All right, so now we've sort of got a base image. I've got all the colors sort of where I want them. I'm going to move into masking now. And this photo I can already see is gonna need a couple. So let's start off with one that I always do for cars. I'll take a radial gradient and I'll go right over the car like this. And you know, just a little bit past the edges of the car, and I'll bring that clarity up like I mentioned, and bring the sharpness up just a little bit. This just helps solidify the car as the subject. This is what you're supposed to be looking at. It's sharp and in focus as best it can be. Okay, for the next mask, we're going to darken up the ground. And usually for that, I'll use a linear gradient. In this instance, I think I'm going to take a radial gradient again, draw it out really big, and sort of create my own vignette. So I'll draw it out really big like this, and then I will come up here and invert it so that I'm creating my own vignette. Drag that feather out a little bit so it's not affecting the car as much, but everything else is going to be affected by it. And bring down that exposure. Yeah. I think that looks good right there, because I want these trees to be dark up here, but I also want the road to be dark. And instead of taking a bunch of linear gradients and trying to do that, you can just take one radial gradient, invert it, and you create a vignette everywhere but the top, because I don't really want the top corners to be super dark because there's sky up there. They don't need to be super dark, but these bottom corners on the road, I want to really push that in towards the middle where the car is. All right, now, these headlights are on and they're making a tiny little reflection on the ground, on that pavement. So I want to highlight that a little bit. So I'm going to take a radial gradient here, position it sort of in line with the way the headlights are casting a highlight, and bring that exposure up just a little bit, bring the clarity up just a little bit, and bring the temperature over just a little bit towards the blues, so that it takes a little bit of that orangey yellow out of the headlights. And now I'm just going to duplicate that mask, drag it over to the other headlights, and where it's shining, there we go. I think that looks good. That really sort of just brings out the headlights just a little, just the tiniest bit. All right, so next I'm going to do another radial gradient, and this is something I like to do a lot. The light was coming from over here, the top left portion of the frame, from over this building. The sun was just getting set, and the light was coming from left to right. And I like to take a radial gradient and I will accent, sort of emphasize where the light was coming from. So I'll take a radial gradient, drag it over really big like this, bring down the dehaze, maybe to -25, and up the exposure just a little bit. That's a little much. Just like that, plus 0.12. And then I'll bring the temperature up towards the yellow, warm up that temperature just a little bit to really make it, to emphasize where the light's coming from. It's a really subtle change, but it can really help create depth in your photos and add a little bit of interest in the sky, because this sky's really gray. And to be quite honest, this could probably be dragged down just a little bit more. And it just gives it a little atmosphere. It just gives it a little bit of atmosphere, and that's what I'm looking for. All right, so in terms of masking, we're pretty much done, other than there's one last thing I'd like to do. With this car specifically, and the fact that I didn't bring a polarizer, this is really helpful if you've forgotten your polarizer. This windshield is like a fishbowl, and it's not like that in real life. He's got good tint on it, but because I didn't bring my polarizer, it's very reflective. You can see through it. It's no good. So I will usually take the brush tool, hit B for the brush tool, and just brush a mask over this windshield like so. And I'll usually go back and correct it, fine tune a little bit, but bring that exposure down some. Not too much, because if you go overboard with this, it can be way too much. And hit that dehaze just a little bit, bring that exposure down, and then I'll make it smaller and go in and kind of get the edges. Like so. Now see, that's exactly what we want. That just makes it a little bit darker. It draws the eye away from the fact that you can see Chandler in there. And I might even go back and erase, click on the eraser tool and erase where the mask is affecting his decal, because that part, it can be bright white, that's awesome. But we don't want the rest of the windshield to be super bright. Now, this is not something you have to do if you're a good photographer and remember your polarizer. I did not, and so this is, just what I have to do. It just helped correct a mistake I made while I was shooting. This looks really good. I'm really happy with this. The last thing I want to do is take out some of these signs. There's a lot of stuff back here that's sort of drawing away from what I want you to look at. Like this red stop sign is right next to the red car, so you'll look at the car and then go, whoop, stop sign. No good, I don't want that. So H for the healing brush. Now I'll bring the feather up, good deal. I usually like to keep it on heal mode because it just tends to be more accurate. Clone can have a lot of harsh lines, and so I don't typically do clone, but there's a time and place for everything, so just use it as you need it. And let's take that sign out. It's all right. Take that sign out, and where it's poking around the tree on that side. Yep. See, zoom out, can't even tell. Go in over here, and I'm gonna do the same thing on this sign. Let's just see if it'll do it. One big stroke. Yeah. Zoom back out, see that? Just make sure, you wanna make sure it looks decently normal. I mean, they're trees, and so it's really pretty easy to do. You can just kind of move it wherever and it'll figure it out. And now last, let's go back here and get this stop sign out of the way. Get that bottom rung of the stop sign. Nope, that's not what I meant to do. This around right here. Let's just see if that'll take it out perfectly. And look at that. That's awesome. Okay, now I think that image is about done. I mean, I might come back and make a few fine-tuning tweaks to it just because that's what I do. I'll sit and edit an image for forever and never be quite exactly happy with it. But I think this looks really good. This is pretty much what I was going for. All right, the last thing I might do is just come back down here and introduce a little bit more saturation of the blues and the shadows. Not quite that much, but maybe somewhere like 9, just to cool off those shadows a little bit and get that, you know, back and forth of the blue and orange. I think this picture looks really good. This is what we started with, and this is what we ended with. I think it's very dramatic. It really pushes your eyes towards the car well, and it's just a really good shot of this car. I think it looks great. All right, well, I think that about does it. If I've taught you something you didn't know or explained something that you thought you knew, please let me know. I'd love to hear about it. And if you've got any questions about editing in Lightroom or anything else related to photography, videography, please let me know. I'd love to answer or help you if I can. And I think that about does it. Y'all like, subscribe, and I'll catch you later.